Alright, so this is my reflection on chapter 24 of the Proverbs. I'm on verse 23, and so without further ado, these things also belong to the wise. It is not good to have respect of persons in judgment. So the first time I read this, I was confused. The first part of it seems to be referring to something else. These things, well, what things? Are we to go back to a prior verse? It would seem that the prior verses really have not much to do with what is being spoken of here. Reading the last two, "My son, fear you the Lord and the King, and meddle not with them that are given to change. For their calamity shall rise suddenly, and who knows the ruin of them both." Now this could be referring to the knowing of that ruin. It could be referring to the general direction that I believe we are prompted to consider, our relationship with the world, but also a broader relationship in that the type of world that is just unseen, that is beyond the immediate. Some would say beyond the physical or the material. I really don't like that conception. It doesn't make much sense to me. Again, not that I am a strict materialist, but the interface of things is always strange and bizarre in ways that we do not expect. These things also belong to the wise. If we are to go on the assumption that we are considering this knowledge, the knowledge of some absolute, some objective value, some value that is outside of the subject, and the relatedness of the subject to that value, I think we can have a productive conversation. Additionally, my mind has been on a particular topic lately, a topic that we are, I think, dealing with today. But it is a recent historical topic regarding the Second World War. And much of the narrative that was surrounding that period between capitalism, free markets, and socialism, or top-down control, and to my surprise, especially when I consider the religiosity, just generally perhaps the philosophical underpinnings of those that founded this nation, I think many of those that are perhaps for free market capitalism are quite secular in nature. That they say that there is no absolute value. In the words of Ludwig von Mises, the Austro-Hungarian political philosopher and economist, "We do not assert that the market prices are to be considered as expressive of any perennial and absolute value. There are no such things as absolute values, independent of the subjective preferences of erring men. Judgments of value are the outcome of human arbitrariness. They reflect all the shortcomings and weaknesses of their authors. Now, this is from his book, Bureaucracy. I find the book interesting. I definitely think it's a worthwhile read, definitely useful for understanding bureaucracy, especially in the modern day. But there's something a bit depressing about this view. There's something a bit unfortunate about somebody so pivotal, I think, to our cultural heritage. And by extension, by consequence of this view, I noticed that much of his defining and much of his reflection on how, or perhaps why, corporations function in the way that they do, and the free market system functions in the way that it does, is very mechanical. It is very self-interested. It is very vain. He does touch on, and I would be interested to read his ideas on morality, but I have not. This is the first book of his that I have read, or that I'm currently reading, so I can't really say much to that effect. I did do some research in terms of his religious or ontological opinions, but I don't really seem to find much of substance. Regardless of that, there is a quality of, there's a massive irony here. There's a quality of the erosion of the possibility of, my mind wants to say self-expression, but that's too simple. It's not quite it. It's, when I think of life, when I think of the beauty in life, I think of context. I think of things that are beautiful, but perhaps situations, events, conversations, whatever, that are organized in such a way that facilitate beauty. Now, we could see beauty in and of itself, perhaps. We can think about anything in particular long enough. I'm sure we can find something good in it. We can take a basic color and find some interest and beauty in it. But it's often within different elements that are communicating with each other in different contexts that allows for the narrative and for the beautiful story to unfold that includes all of the colors and the melodies of life. And it also includes the more of the negative aspects, because this is another aside, but I had a conversation not too long ago with somebody about the major and minor in music, and how you can have something that is in major. You can get this sort of elated sense, this joyful sense, but there can be minor chords in there. There can be on the road, or on the whole, when we examine a song that is in a major key, we may find that there are some minor intervals. Now, I'm not a music person, I'm not a musician, but I do really enjoy music. And although I may not understand perfectly what major and minor are, regardless of the interval, of the key or of the scale, my mind generally interprets by emotion. At least when I'm listening to a piece, I'm considering the emotional quality that it has to it. My mind is not geared towards identification of intervals. Perhaps if I listened to it for that purpose, maybe I could find it, but it's much more geared towards the emotion of it. I would also say that there is recognition of pattern, and insofar as there is recognition of pattern, I'm sure that I do pick up on interval, but not for the sake of interval. It's more for the sake of purpose and direction. Now, I say that to say that a piece of music, perhaps it may be interpreted in a few different ways, but a direction is a direction, and we will always be taken in a particular direction when we listen to music. Some forms of music, I think, are better than others at developing the atmosphere and the purposeful approach. Some are more suited for the background, perhaps. There are many different forms of music that engage the aspects of self, that excite the heart, stimulate the mind, the rational mind. And I promise I'm getting somewhere. When I think of von Mises and his worldview, perhaps, it's a secular worldview, the irony comes in when I consider that our nation, the United States, was founded by a group of people, for the most part, that had left their nation to practice their religion without persecution. And they separated their church and their religious practices from their state apparatus. They gave their state apparatus certain powers and authorities and restricted its domain into the aspects of their minds that was and is devoted to identifying with something outside of themselves. And now 150 years later, after Western civilization had largely lost its faith in God, what was left over was the individual pursuit in a different context. The individual's pursuit for their own desires, their selfish desires. Now, of course, there will always exist sacrifice for others outside of ourselves. But given his approach to understanding business, to understanding the satisfying of different market drives and of demands, while all of this I think is quite important to understand, it seems as though he has given himself a ceiling, a roof, for which the self, in irony, is reduced by his own insular nature. Now, he does speak of the role of government not being involved in how the collective, how the participants in an economy, a free market economy with private property, how the state ought not to influence the buying or decision-making behavioral habits of the individuals, which I agree with. But it is so limited in the sense that this collective is disparate. It is constantly communicating with one another for their own greedy purposes. They're moving towards the success of business only to make a profit, regardless of that of if that profit is good or if it is bad, because of course there is no absolute value, after all. Now, I don't mean to make any definitive statements about how the situation can be solved, and how the obvious, given that this is well after the Second World War, and we are in 2023, 2024, I don't even know. I'm not sure it really matters anymore. But I've found ourselves, I think, in a situation where the broader spirit of our free market system has been polluted by a greedy force, again, a greedy spirit. And it does matter how the individual behaves and what the individual believes. Now, I don't think that von Mises would disagree with that, but I'm not entirely sure what his opinion would be given the quote that I had read. Now, why mention this? So I'll bring our attention back to a prior verse. My son, fear you the Lord and the King, and meddle not with them that are given to change, for their calamities shall rise suddenly, and who knows the ruin of them both. Now, I'd refer anyone to the last episode, because I had went into some detail about those verses. And about what it means for this change to occur. And without reinventing that wheel now, what I will say is that there can be many ways in which a person can view a word. But there are only a select number of ways that I think that a word can be used in a sentence and makes coherent sense. And in an absolute sense, with no restrictions, I would say that it wouldn't make sense to interpret that verse or to interpret the way in which the word change is used. Because change occurs all the time. There are ways in which we are committed to a certain type of change. For example, we have to change the oil in our cars. The oil is this lubricating substance that allows the parts to move against one another without causing damage or to reduce the damaging forces. As the oil ages, its lubricating properties decrease, make it less effective at lubricating the components of the engine. And so just by virtue of time and decay, change must occur, such that we renew, regenerate, replenish. But this is not the type of change, I think, that is referred to in that verse. And it's important in the context of verse 23, the verse that we're currently talking about, the first half of it, I should say. These things also belong to the wise. Because I think the wise person understands that if we are to connect one thing to another, we must take care in the way in which it is connected. The relationship matters. The position matters. That it may be appropriate to change our oil, but it may not be appropriate to think ourselves as gods or to think ourselves as beings that can do things that the physical substrate will not allow us to do. And I had used the example the other day about speaking into the microphone and not having it plugged in and expecting it to record. There's a certain respective interface that we have to understand that we are subject to. There's a law that we are subject to that we cannot break. And it is my assertion that this law extends both to the physical interactions with the world as it does with the meaningful and purposeful. That our values are not entirely subjective, that there is some objective basis to them. But that's not to say that we have no will and no agency. I think that there is a subjective quality to what we see as valuable. But it would be a mistake to say that that quality represents the entire identity of value. Lately, this topic of identity or identifying something and its qualities has become increasingly at the front of my attention. It would seem as though our culture has difficulty with identification. And at first glance, it's not entirely clear why that this is happening, or that it is happening in the bizarre way that it is. But although, in many situations, in many cases, the implicit landscape affords us with much of the groundwork, that there are plenty of things in our environment that are obviously distinct from other things, and the identification of them goes along with that accordingly. We can easily identify qualities of particular things that make them things, independent from other things. But it seems like when we get to categories that are either unseen or complex, and they are beyond the immediately observable, and it takes time to understand the pattern of a particular thing, then it would seem that we have more of a difficult time identifying something. That it's easy enough to identify a particular person, but it's hard to identify political persuasion. It's hard to identify cultural distinction. I'm not saying it's possible, but it's just difficult to do so. It's hard to identify philosophical underpinnings and ontological presuppositions. Again, all of these things are difficult, but not impossible to identify. Even the word belong, these things also belong to the wise. That be part of the word, the prefix, it supposes that the thing in question is a part of this broader, or related to, and by its relation may be thought of as part of, the domain around which the wise person is responsible for seeing, responsible for doing, responsible for reflecting, whatever. And so just as much, I think, as this verse is prompting us to consider that fact, it is prompting us to consider the broader domain in which we must orient ourselves relative to other identities. It is not good to have respect of persons in judgment. Now, in my mind, I think of an image that involves a tiered perspective of thought, in which the foundational tier, or the beginning of the sequence of thoughts that occurs because of a situation that occurs because of some event, that there is some stimulus that then provokes a thought to occur. I think of at the inception of this thought, I think of judgment being the first thing. That perhaps if I imagine myself in a situation, perhaps I see somebody and there's something about their physical characteristics that stand out to me, and I form an opinion, I form some judgment based on what I observe. Now perhaps this judgment has something to do with their character. So now we have a foundational step. The step is that fogginess that surrounds my initial interpretation or identification of a person in question. Inside of this environment is going to be born new thoughts. I suppose there are different ways that we can consider exactly how this is connected. We can think of it perhaps as a chain, in which the next link in that chain is going to be necessarily connected to that judgment of how they look, and then based on how they look, we went to their character. Often this sort of thing, I think, has unfortunate results, but that's the point. This word respect is important, and to have it born within judgment, I have to wonder. Now we will get into the word respect in a moment, but I have to wonder, much like a seed that is planted in the soil. If the soil is not fertile, if the link in the chain prior to the link of respect is weak, then that's going to be a weak chain link. And any particular force or observation may undo that link. And the respect then would be sort of floating in an empty manner away from a proper judgment. Now, with regard to the definition of the word respect, we have esteem or admiration. Now, this may be elicited by abilities, qualities, or achievements. We have consideration, due regard for the feelings, wishes, rights, or traditions of others. In terms of the etymological origin, from Latin we have the prefix re, meaning back or again. We have the suffix of the word respectus, the specere, or specere, a verb meaning to look or to see, so to look or to see back or again. Now, regardless of the road that we take from that origin, whether it be thinking back at perhaps our initial conception, that prior link in the chain, or we take the modern conception more of the esteem and admiration route, either way, I think it's going to be very difficult to form positive judgments about somebody if or maybe I should say it's quite difficult to form a judgment without somebody, without entering into an environment that is fruitful, an environment that holds something highly. And I think that if we are going to do this about a person, let's say we're meeting them for the first time, those first appearances, I think, get me quite often. And perhaps there are some good patterns in there for which we can reasonably suspect a person is going to behave or do something in a particular way based on how we initially observed them to be. But I think what this verse is getting at here is prompting us to consider the elements of their identity, since, again, we're coming off of the first part of the verse in which we are prompted to consider identification and identity and the qualities therein. That once we identify a person, what we should go to are the things that we know fundamentally about all people, or at least we should have some conception, is that they do have intrinsic value. We believe people to have intrinsic value. And unlike paper money that loses its value over time, we think of a person and their value not in terms of economic standing or skillful integrity, which I think are both important. But we think of them first in terms of creative agents, that they possess the qualities of creation. And then we go from there. And so the respect that is paid, especially given somebody that we haven't met, there's not much we can do, but it is the recognition of the fundamental humanity that is there. Rather than denying that and then forming this error or this cloud of judgment that may make it difficult to have a fruitful conversation or a fruitful interaction. He that say unto the wicked, You are righteous, him shall the people curse, nations shall abhor him. But to them that rebuke him shall be delight, and a good blessing shall come upon them. So today is a new day. Today happens to be a Monday. A good day. Perhaps a day with a difficult beginning, but surely a good day. Now it is the evening. It is after work. And I find myself almost at all times when I sit down to record one of these in a particular state of mind. I've sort of conditioned myself in this way to find that inner solace, inner peace that is always necessary to enter into the domain of reflection and thought, inquiry, learning. It feels as though there is time. There's time to explore, time to take a deep breath, he that says unto the wicked, You are righteous. This is where we will stop and set up camp. The meaning that is being explored here is being covered in two verses, a common theme in this chapter, chapter 24. And as always, I'm going to take this part by part, bit by bit. I think there is a lot of consequential or causal steps that we have to take in order to get from one place to the next. Much of this may feel apparent or may feel obvious, but to truly satisfy the mind, I think, to truly comprehend and to participate with what is being said, I think we have to take this sort of meticulous approach. So now the question, what does it mean to say to the wicked that you are righteous? Now, of the wicked, I have described an individual that is self-centered. I've often used in the past images of an ancient city or of perhaps a cell. For whatever reason, right now I'm thinking about the literal inside of a dome, like I'm looking inside of my head. Sort of a funny thing to be imagining, because I'm imagining the physical space rather than a potential landscape for which my mind can participate. But that's just the point. The wicked imagine themselves within something, isolated, that their purpose, their experience, is dependent upon themselves, dependent upon the meaning and the purpose that they choose, the feelings and desires that are in the moment, that they need not to be subordinate to something else or to some higher authority. The wicked is somebody that is self-centered, an expression that I find interesting. It's colloquial, surely. It is used often. To be self-centered, and generally to think about the concept of centering. To be self-centered is to imply that we are placing the self at the center of something, obviously. But the question is, well, what is that center? We are obviously imagining something for which we can orient that which we conceive ourselves to be, that we have a mind that has advanced to the place where a sort of a meta-reflection on its own experience is possible. It is afforded by perhaps we can say the progression of mind or the development of mind that we have. I'm not entirely convinced that a prehistorical human being would consider or reflect on himself and his ways in this manner. But nonetheless, the Western person in the year 2024 has this capacity. And with this capacity, I think it opens a lot of doors. But it can, by selfish conceit, perhaps, close them. And I've used the term often, this self or auto-axialization, that there is an axis around which one's attention rotates, and all of their meaningful behavior, attitude, again, attention, revolves around that axis. And for the axis to be the self, auto-axial, it is to prop up and to have as the highest good one's own desire. Now there's a caveat, because we can say of desire many things. A person can desire many things. But it is of personal desire. It is of a type of self-gain, self-satisfaction, a rigidity of self, a psychological prison for which the wicked person thinks it offers them comfort, it offers them peace. It is something that satisfies the urges, that quiets the mind, perhaps. difficult situation to be in, no doubt, to come out of that sort of experience and to recenter one's whole being. It cannot be an easy task. Now, if we consider, I've done this exercise before. I like to do it quickly here, maybe not quickly, we'll see how it goes, but the etymological chain of the word wicked I find interesting. Now, like many words that we use, the origins of the word wicked come from Proto-Indo-European and Old English and Proto-Germanic. The word wicked emerged in Middle English as wicked, W-I-K-K-E-D, or witched, W-I-C-C-H-E-D. And during this period, it was used to describe somebody that was morally wrong or evil. In Old English, the word Wicca meant witch, so associated with sorcery, evil practices, and then leading to that moral connotation of the wicked. Now, from the Proto-Germanic, we have the word Wicca, which refers to somebody who practices witchcraft or sorcery, practices evil things. From Proto-Indo-European, we have the root weg, W-E-G, meaning to be strong or to be lively. The root evolving in many different directions, but it included associations with strength, and in the case of the word that we're talking about here, wicked, with the misuse of power or unnatural practices. And so if we can think about the witch, now let's put gender aside for the moment, we think about the type of person who practices sorcery, who practices evil. Maybe we can say both of these don't really help us much, I think, in understanding what the word wicked means. But they practice something that is contrary. They misuse something. What they do is unnatural. Again, all terms, much like I was talking about before, about the center, about autoaxialization, these terms are all referring to something else. They are all words that exist with reference or relationship to something else, with some prior thought or conception in mind. That if something is unnatural, then there is a natural way to do things. If there is a misuse of power, then there is a proper use of it. Now, for a moment, I'd like to explore the term, or the word, sorcerer. For in my mind, though it is becoming less so, I think of a rather cartoonish illustration of what this person would have been considered. A sorcerer being a person who claims or is believed to have magical powers associated with casting spells or performing enchantments. Now, there's something about this archetype that in the 21st century, in the 20th century, has been given a particular characterization. And I have to wonder how the ancient people would have saw these people. I have to imagine that there was something more than just some grand conspiracy, that people eventually found somebody else as a scapegoat and labeled them a witch because of something that they believed in or something that they were doing. I think there's an element of that is true. But I also think that what the person was doing can provide us, what the sorcerer was doing, that is, can provide us with some interesting ideas for which we can conceptualize the wicked. If we start to move away from the cartoonish illustration and the more weak-minded and fearful approach to something that we don't understand, again, this sorcerer and the magic that they practice, I think may come to us in a form of understanding that is more mature, that it is something more immediate to our physical experience. That's not to say that there may not be magical things about it, but in the way that we experience magic in the popular culture today, I think it's something that we need to put behind us. Now, going back to Latin, we have the word sortiarius, which means one who casts lots, or fortune teller. The root sors means lot or fate. And so when we consider this lot or fate, or the identification of that which one has been given, I think the practice of magic, the sorcerer or the witch, are individuals that identify patterns about somebody else or about perhaps a society that most people don't seem to understand or grasp. Now, this may be by their ingenious, or it may be by difficult deliberation. I suppose we can imagine many different situations in which a witch can cause disruption, or a sorcerer can cause disruption. Now, in the case of a sorcerer that I would be interested in observing, I would think of a man that is quite intelligent. I would think of a man that is quite observant. I would think of a man that has a very open mind, but not open to the degree that it destroys his reason. I also think of a man that, as we have discussed about the wicked, is selfish, that uses his insights for his own purposes, for his own ends. And the fortune that he tells, he warps it so that people may believe a falsehood, or he tells aspects of what he sees. He may say aspects of what he knows to be true, but organizes the information in a way that would disrupt the mind and its logical orientation. It may pervert the desires. What can we say of the grandness of potential that exists within the spells, the enchantments that a clever person can enact on the psychology of man? Well, I think that we can say that there is a lot there that can be explored and that can be utilized for wicked ends or evil ends, for morally corrupt ends. Now, from the Greek, the word sortiari, which means lot or fate, again, this is something that seems to emphasize the role of this person, the sorcerer or the witch, manipulating or predicting some outcome. Now, in order to predict the outcome, especially in the human case, I think deals with a bit of projection, certainty that probably doesn't exist in the future of events that can unfold in any number of ways. Now, I'd like to say something as an aside, but I imagine that a person who devotes their attention towards the exploration of fates, for example, that is, the identification of that power that is determined, that is beyond the control of the individual. I would imagine that this exploration may not necessarily have to be conducted by somebody that is wicked or evil. I can imagine a just agent that would desire this sort of thing. I would question how far it can go on the part of a just agent. But since we are considering the wicked here, this is the path that my mind is going when I mention the witch or the sorcerer. Okay, so let's zoom back out for a moment out of our rabbit hole that we went down. And so now we have this term of the wicked. We have my initial thoughts on the matter, and then the etymological information. All of this forms a picture of the type of person that is considered wicked. And the wicked person, unlike the fool, I think is particularly attentive, purposeful. That their direction is decided on, much like evil, the evil person. I think that which separates the wicked and evil is a matter of degree. But nonetheless, I maintain that the wicked is somebody that is autoaxial. And they are also intelligent. And so they are manipulative people. And so what does it mean, then, to call a wicked person, this manipulative, self-centered person, righteous? Where have we placed this person? And back to the Proto-Germanic, Proto-Indo-European rabbit hole. Now from Old English, we have the word righteous that comes from the word ritwis, or rightwise, which means just, upright, or morally right. Rit, R-I-H-T, means right or correct. Wis, W-I-S, which is the suffix of that word, related to the word wise, manner or way. From Proto-Germanic, we have the word writ that is then derived from the Proto-Germanic language. I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but R-E-K-H-T-A-Z, rectas, meaning straight, right, or just. Now from the Proto-Indo-European, we have the root reg, R-E-G, meaning to move in a straight line, to lead straight, or to rule. Now this root is what is said here in my source, the origin of various words across the Indo-European languages related to direction, rule, and correctness. But in summation, what we have is the word right, which means correct, just, and then we have the suffix, which is related to the word wise, again, a way. So we can think of the righteous, a term that means the way of being just, the way of being right, the way of being good. And so it is not the what I want to say, it is not the essence of being good, though it possibly can be that, but rather the way of being good. And this sort of thing in my mind is much more difficult to identify, but as I think of people that I've met in my life, people have a particular way to them. Their way is influenced by all sorts of things in life, their experiences, their education, their beliefs. But all the same, if this is something that could be identified, somebody's way, well, what exactly does it mean? When I think of way, perhaps we can consider going to a physical location, and the act or the experience of moving from point A to point B, driving in our car, we are taking the way to get there. In a like manner, if we imagine that there is some destination for which the mind can arrive at something that is right, that is true, that is correct, that is good, then the way to get there is not much different from that of the experience of driving in a car. And the closer we get to our destination, the closer we are to being good, just, or right. Now, it could be said, it could be the case, the situation. I had this happen over the weekend. I live near one of the largest cities in the United States, and I went downtown to that city, and I had somebody else driving, thankfully. But this person took a wrong turn when we were going home. And so, what can be said of this way then was that it was contrary to our aims. It was contrary to our destination. In the terms of righteousness, it would be contrary to the destination of what is right, or what is good, what is correct. And I think if we are to call a wicked person righteous, what we are saying is that the destination to the good is actually towards the bad. It is actually towards manipulation. It is actually towards something of a false end, of poor sight. And these sorts of adjectives are surely not something that we would want to be wrapped up within our conception of that which is good, or that which is right. And so for this reason, I would have to say that we do not call a wicked person righteous. Him shall the people curse. Nations shall abhor him. So let's go into this a little bit. What does it mean for somebody to curse somebody else? Now, we are considering that the person in question here, the person that is being cursed, is the person that called a wicked person righteous. Now, this may be a situation in which the person that had done this was listened to by somebody else, and that led them down that way. That led them to the way of wickedness. Now, much like the word witch or sorcerer or magic, I have difficulties with these terms. I think it's my own shortcomings that I fail to see exactly how this is meaningful. Now, curse is something that I've explored before, so I know that there's quite a bit of meaning here. And even in terms like witch and sorcerer, I had an understanding that there is something quite interesting about the term itself, and that for the term to be used for so many years throughout the ages that it is something more than a shallow or a hollow structure that houses very little meaning. I think it is quite the opposite. And much like this word curse, I have a similar inclination. And so I'm going to go through this exercise again that I went through with the word wicked, went through with the word righteous. Now, in my understanding as it is now, the word curse holds a particular place that is a little bit more than a number of years ago, in which I would have put this word off, moved it away from me, dismissing it, saying it was something that was other than worth my time. Because at that time, I would have considered that this word was something to do with the supernatural, was something to do with, and in my mind at the time, I should say, since we're coming off of the first part of this verse, considering that it is possible for another person to find themselves in a position of mind to use their experience and their wittiness to disrupt somebody else's experience, or for somebody to mislabel somebody else as being righteous when they are wicked, to turn the path of somebody that wishes to go home anywhere but the direction of home. At the time, I would have considered that this word curse meant something like that, but not necessarily the word, but rather the usage of the word, because it referred to some supernatural entity. And that because I didn't necessarily believe in a supernatural entity, that I was being led down a path of false righteousness. I was being moved away from where I wanted to go, which was home. Now, I could say that where I am now is in a strange position. Although I can say perhaps that I believe in a supernatural being, I don't like the term supernatural. I don't know what it means, really. But I do know that I have come to an understanding of something greater beyond myself that is purposeful and directive. And because of that, the curse is something that occupies some meaning. And even in the mouths of men, a curse can have influence. If a curse is to be an expression, an identification of some event that has occurred, some utterance, I think it could be said, there's a lot that can be said for the attention that is placed on making something that was otherwise unknown or implicit, explicit and known, and drawing the light of the mind of man onto something that it had otherwise either wished to not see or didn't see it at all. So let's explore this word in a little bit more detail, the word curse. Now, if anyone can guess where we're going. We're going back to Old English. We're going back to Proto-Germanic roots. Now, the term has a long-standing association with invoking harm or expressing strong negative wishes. From Middle English, the word curse appears quite similarly. referring to the act of invoking harm or misfortune upon somebody. Now, what I would like to draw particular attention to is the word invoke, which we will come back to. From Old English, we have the word curse, C-U-R-S, which carried a similar meaning of invoking harm or calling down evil. Another interesting expression, calling down evil. Proto-Germanic, the word curse, that Old English, likely stems from the Proto-Germanic root kors, K-O-R-S. Well, my source here says it's uncertain if it exactly came from that, but it could be related to words meaning to invoke or to swear. To swear, another interesting one. To swear, like curse, it doesn't really offer us much, but to invoke, I think, is quite interesting. So we will keep that in mind. Now, of the possible Proto-Indo-European roots, even if we don't have something that is direct and definitive, there's a root that I don't know how to pronounce, G with the superscript H-E-R-S, I don't know what that means. It means to call or to cry out. And there's a link there to that invoking of the curse. So we're sort of going back into this realm of magic. There's something of bad luck. There's something of a spell that has been cast. There's something about this invoking or wishing for misfortune. So of this word invoke, what can we say? What does it mean? It is to make an appeal. It is to turn to something. It is to orient our attention towards something. And as we know at this point, in my reflections on the Proverbs, that our attention has a lot to do with the way that we see things, obviously. It has a lot to do with the way in which we communicate with the broader potential of mind and the potential agents that exist within that sphere that we contact, that influence our behavior, however high or however far we choose to take it. So again, this word invoke, to cite or to appeal to turn to call on. Now, if I am to call on something, to call on someone, I think of when I was in school and the teacher would call on me. She is invoking me, I suppose, in a way that I'm a person that is being appealed to, maybe not necessarily appealed to, or I could say appealed to answer a question, but I'm not necessarily an authority. All of that specific is not really necessary here, but the point is that what happens when I am called on in class is now that the attention is on me, that I am now responsible for something. Now I suppose we can ask the question, well, this came up in the last episode. There's a discussion about the way in which the mind can formulate the map of its experience. And it could be wrong, it could be right, it could be in delusion. But I suppose that we can say that we can appeal to anything. We can invoke anything. I can appeal to the remote control that's in front of me. The remote control for a TV that I never use. What would that mean? Well, the appeal is one-sided in this situation because I'm appealing to an object. So I'm essentially appealing to myself to draw my attention towards the object. And as my attention goes to the object, what I'm considering is the object's purpose, its function, its position. By position, we examine authority. Now, the remote control doesn't have much authority, but it does occupy a position, more than just a physical position. That it is an object that is designed purposefully to turn on my television. It has a few different options on the remote to do different things. You change the channel, increase or decrease the volume, whatever. And so if I invoke this remote and I draw attention to it, I'm drawing attention to its purpose and its function. Now suppose I went farther and I did this to a person. Well, now there's a bit of reciprocation that can occur there, but fundamentally I think we are offered a similar image. But in this situation, unlike the object, I'm appealing to a person that is quite variable. Although they may have a purpose, much like the remote, it's much harder to see than some concrete example such as this. And in terms of a person, what I'm appealing to is some of the fundamentals of their existence, of their being, of their ontology. And as I do so, I wonder exactly where it is. Of course, it's a product of mind, it's a product of some material process, but that doesn't really matter. What does matter is where my appeal is going, where the attention is, where I am turning my attention to. Of a person, there are multiple aspects. I can turn my attention to some negative aspect of somebody. Perhaps a person at work is particularly bad at adjudicating their responsibility. It doesn't have to be that. It could be anything. It could be more positive. But the point is, I'm drawing my attention to that thing, towards that way, towards that purpose. And since now my attention is towards that way and towards that purpose, I can see where it is going. I can see that my attention is following or is trying to grasp and to understand the purpose or the function of a particular scenario or behavior. I could scale this up into forms that are a bit more ethereal, a bit more heavenly, like one's disposition. I can imagine again, just like a remote, somebody's disposition, sort of a conglomeration of all the various qualities of an individual, somebody that I know well, perhaps. And I formulate some idea in my mind of how I can interact with the thing that I am appealing to, the thing that I'm citing, the thing that I'm calling on, the thing that I'm turning to. And we can imagine a situation in which this is scaled all the way up to more of the heavenly principles, or the lack thereof, perhaps in the domain of that which is beyond the material. We can say that if I were to invoke evil or to invoke goodness, whatever, this sort of thing would be the orientation of my attention and the relationship that I am making with this form, with this conception, with this idea. such that I am either just desirous to use it, just like I'm desirous to use the remote, or curious at what its function is. Regardless of the situation, I am calling that into attention. Now, calling it into my own attention for purposes of observation really doesn't do all that much, but calling it into my attention to use it to turn on the television does something. And it does something more if more people are involved. If turning my attention to some form of evil, such that I wish to do more than just to understand it, but to use it, and to use it against people, this now becomes something that is more of a curse. Now, in the context of this verse, I think we have to remember that what we are talking about is the people are cursing the individual who made the mistake at calling the wicked person righteous. So there is a convoluted scenario that we have to piece together. So today is a new day, and I promise that I will resume my previous thought in a moment. But as it stands, my head is spinning with thoughts and spinning with feelings. How much of it is important, I don't know. But it's a strange thing, a strange experience to have, and I have it often, in which my head spins, not in the sense of dizzying, but spins in the sense that it is longing for something, that it is trying to find something, spinning as though it is turning around various degrees in its visual field, trying to find the thing that it seemingly had lost, the thing that it is longing for. And there are various melodies that have occurred throughout the day being of the most salient, because they're the most recent. The melodies and the patterns of interactions, interpersonal exchanges that I turn to. And I wonder about these melodies sometimes. I wonder why the mind fixates on certain things. Why the mind wishes perhaps that something had gone a little bit differently, or perhaps something about a particular experience that the mind didn't quite understand at the time, until it sat down in the awaiting silence, almost as if the silence is eager to hear what the mind has to find. And as I've sat here, and I've felt the pull of this silence, what begins to flood into me is all of these experiences from the day, from the working day. Different prompts, some of it a bit chaotic. Again, there is this spinning sensation. I said I had denied a dizziness type of quality to it, but perhaps there is a dizzying type of quality to it, and that the mind is flooded with information and memories, but all of these memories are flowing through in order for, much like a slot machine almost, but more of a controlled slot machine, I would say, that when something passes, it is not as though it would be by sheer probability that I would be able to stop my mind to catch it. As something passes, I can go back to it. It's not an issue, unlike the slot machine. and I can find my prize if I choose to reflect hard enough and to find it. Now, perhaps I won't bore with some of the details of the memories that I chose to fixate on, but rather just offer up that reflection as I enter back into this reflection on the Proverbs. And so, if I may be allowed, I would like to retrace a few of my steps. Not too long, but just enough to get back into it. The matter of the wicked, the matter of the false claim on righteousness, or the false attribution of righteousness to the wicked. The people that curse the one that has made this mistake. Now I had come to some idea of the curse. That the curse is something of a tool. It's more than a tool. It is an aspect of mind. Perhaps it's a fundamental way in which the mind relates to objects, but more so than just objects, as I've mentioned, it's more than just the remote. Concepts, ideas, spirits, transpersonal agents, types of agencies that we would not recognize, and yet we seemingly articulate with them. We articulate with our thoughts, we articulate with our memories. We pull them down as if they were an object in the store that had some purpose. And we keep them, and I think of my aunt who had kept so much garbage in her basement. And I have to wonder what her mind was thinking. She must have thought that there must be, at some point, some use for the object that she was storing, holding on to it. But we hold on to these things with the expectation that there will be some usefulness for it. Oftentimes I think that there is. Sometimes there is not. But much like this remote, much like its function and its purpose for which it was designed, I think that of nature. I think that of concepts and thoughts, either thoughts that have been put together or of something like a rock in the environment for which I can pick it up and use it as a tool for some particular purpose to meet some end. Regardless of the sophistication of our articulations, it is the case that we, as willful agents, endow purpose and meaning to such things. And I also think that, especially when it comes to more of the psychological sphere, the conscious domain, the spiritual domain, there are things for which we don't understand. There are forces at play within mind, within psychology, that operate independent of just the individual. Of course, the physical world operates in this way. We can manipulate it to meet our ends, as I've said, but all of the things that are in front of me are independent of what I would consider to be myself. There's nothing that I can do to integrate a pen into me. Perhaps I can use the pen to articulate thoughts and my philosophies on a page of paper. Interestingly, there's something about this Bible, although the physical structure of the book cannot enter into me in the way that I would, well, perhaps I could eat it. Rather strange sort of situation, but there's another way in which it would enter into me. Another way in which I would be open to understanding the purpose of it, by reading it, by reflecting on it, by using it to think, to turn on that television of mind and to explore and to see different things. Now, all of that perhaps is well and good. But the convoluted aspect of the first part of this verse is that a curse, I think, is generally negative. For in order to curse somebody, what we are drawing down, what we are playing with, what we are willfully interacting with, I think is a type of evil. For to curse somebody, now I may be wrong, but to curse somebody is to make an appeal to something, to some form, to some identity. Much like, again, I'm going to keep on going back to this physical analogy because it is helping me understand exactly where I'm going. But much as I refer to the remote because I may want to turn on the television, I refer to something in the spiritual domain because I want to reduce the impact or set right the way of the distinction or the communication, perhaps, articulation between one individual and another. And since we're considering this verse, I'm thinking about that in terms of falsely attributing righteousness to the wicked. Now, I believe that there's a way in which I may be wrong about that cursing somebody is inherently evil. But there's also a way in which I don't quite understand how it is not. Of the first instance, perhaps it is possible that it is not an evil thing if what we are doing is good to correct it. But then the contrarian in me suggests that, well, it is possible, or that it is the case, that in order to do good under such a situation, it would require us to do a form of evil. And that form of evil would come in the domain of appealing to it, such that it would lead to the downfall of the individual who had made such a falsehood. Now, there are glimmerings of Christ in here, I think. But certainly he is in the future. He is to come. Now, what do I mean by that? First, I'll ask the question of this curse and of the contrarian in me that seems to suggest that it is all but impossible for a type of evil or a type of wickedness not to be appealed to in order for an individual to be set right. Now, what I think might help us here is to examine the second order effects. And by this I mean, for example, in this illustrative landscape of mine, if I had come to an understanding of some poor interaction in which somebody had falsely attributed righteousness to wickedness, and I appealed to something to set that situation right. But it's a particular type of appeal, because it is not just the invoking of goodness, such that the goodness would set something straight. I am invoking something that is burdensome. A curse is something that stays with somebody. It is something that draws them away. It is not something that builds them up or rectifies, facilitates truth. It is something that inherently breaks down. When somebody says that there's a curse on a family, that family has been reduced somehow. They have been burdened by disease. They have had multiple deaths within the family, perhaps. Perhaps there's an unfortunate strain of alcoholism that runs through the family. Whatever the situation might be. The curse is that type of burden. It is the type of burden that draws somebody, as all evil does, into nothingness, into darkness, into the land of that which is barely intelligible, as long as the mind is well and alive. It seeks, if not for itself, a vegetative type of state in others, such that it can control it. And the curse is a perfect thing to do it. And so, although I think that we can say a lot of calling upon something higher, perhaps something in the land of the heavenly domain, in the spiritual realm, calling upon something there and bringing it down to us, invoking it, although this can be good, it can be bad. And it is by distinction, I think, that we say that a curse is something that inherently refers to the invoking or the calling down of something that is evil, to burden somebody else. Now, the proper way would be to justify our invocation. And if we are to wish to do good, we must invoke something that is good, so it would not be a curse, but rather a form of salvation. And this is where Christ comes into the picture. It would be the question of, well, how is this person that had falsely attributed wickedness to righteousness, that they believe that what is righteous is actually wicked, how is that person to find themselves out of that situation, outside of being cursed? It would seem that it's not necessary to curse somebody that feels as though that their belief is that a wicked person is righteous or is just. It seems that they are already on the path to darkness. Now, it may be a situation of position, of authority on the part of the person that is attributing this wickedness to righteousness, in the sense that if somebody in authority or in a position of power, a position of influence, holds these particular views, then one might want to curse them such that it continues to reduce them to that place of infantilism, to the place that would necessarily reduce their position. But I think that there may be a conflict there, and that it is not necessarily possible, or a misconception. If one is in a position, it may very well be the case, if somebody's in a position of power, that a curse may just bring further evil to the position of power, and not necessarily reduce the individual to a state of mere incompetency, which it may do. Again, the person may remain in that position of power, or the position itself, via the institution, may become parasitized by the curse. I think there's a lot of different ways in which this type of poison can penetrate the bloodstream of man's collective mind. And I think it's dangerous at that level. But it's understandable why a person would curse such a thing. But if we are to say, well, actually, there is a way of understanding that which is righteous. There's a way of understanding. There's a path to follow. And the path to follow is Christ. Then it becomes a case of salvation, rather than a case of damnation through cursing, or just general damnation. He that says unto the wicked, You are righteous, him shall the people curse. Nations shall abhor him. So now, is there anything in the third part of the first half of this conjoined verse, maybe we should say, that has any more value, or is it just there for emphasis? Now, the word abhor means to regard with extreme repugnance, to feel hatred or loathing for. And so, part of my mind says that this word is again used as emphasis, but I think there is a form of, it's hard to say, but I think that there is, I've seen this sort of pattern before in the Proverbs, that it is a bit layered, and it's hard to tell exactly in which direction it's layered. It's either layered as it's coming off of the gas pedal, moving away from the curse, but it's still stepping on that sentiment of the evil element that is involved with the response, the potential response to evil itself. In my mind, I think of this self-destructive experience in which evil, again, is this parasite that infects something that destroys itself, but also destroys everything around it. For to abhor something, almost like a curse, I think it appeals to our feelings more than it does a solid reflective state in which we are explicitly putting something out there into the world. We are, in the case of the curse, I think of something that is enacted. I think of interacting with something, invoking something physically. If I am going to, again, turn on the television, I'm interacting with the tool that serves the purpose to meet that end. Likewise, if we are to place the curse into the world, we are going to use the tool that would allow the curse to take root to satisfy our imaginings. But we are not necessarily talking about empty curses here. We're not talking about some hypothetical TV for which I could turn on with a remote. This is an actuality that is in front of me. Now, I think I'm going to go on a bit of a detour for a second here, but I have this I annoy myself with this, that at times since I am the 21st century man, I do think quite materially. But every time I do so, there's something about it that says, you live in both worlds. And although that your experience is heavily tied to that which you consider to be material, that you ought to be careful about separating the two too far away from each other. Because much like a muscle eventually forms into a tendon that inserts into the bone, it is not as though there is no relationship between the two tissues. And although one is different than another morphologically, the muscle belly itself contains elements of the tendon, and the tendon serves to facilitate the muscle's pull. And it serves this broader sequence of purposes that are all interconnected. And so differences physically, or perhaps interactively, experientially, I take pause these days to attribute to them too much value. Because I know that if I separate something too much based off of some superficial distinction, I will miss the greater value underneath, much like somebody may attribute to somebody's superficial characteristics of their identity, and attribute these characteristics to something that is deeper and load-bearing when in fact it is not. So today is a new day, and I would very much like to square this verse off so I can progress. But I'll say a few more things about this word abhorrence because I don't think that I had finished it yesterday. Now, I debated a little bit about which direction I should go here, and I think that focusing on a personal experience might be useful here. After all, our personal experiences have to be integrated into our beliefs and our faith. So I don't think it's a surprise to anybody in the year 2024 that we are on the verge of something, that our society is changing rapidly, that the feeling of our nation is changing. And given those of a particular, maybe an emotional disposition, or those that are a bit more sensitive, like myself, it's easy to pick up on these sorts of things. And not to pick up on it in a way that is exaggerated or overly emotional, that it places us down, that we use it as an excuse not to perform in society, but rather to notice it and to reflect on it. What I see here in this verse, him shall the people curse, nation shall abhor him. We have an action and we have more of a feeling of disgust when I see something, or maybe smell something that is off, perhaps something that is rotten. The disgust comes quickly. There's a revulsion, there's a pulling away of it. Now, my feeling is one thing, and my behavior and my action is another. I may be disgusted and displeased by something that is rotten. I may be displeased by what is happening in our society. I may not understand exactly where the smell is coming from, but I know that I can smell it. The behavior and the action is to remove that thing that causes us to feel that disgust. We don't just sort of accept that this is how things are going to be. At the level of the nation, it's quite an interesting reflection. Abhorrence is attributed to a level of consciousness. It is built of many individuals that form the nation, that form that collective consciousness. And for that collective agent to have a feeling such as abhorrence, to the spirit of it to pull away in disgust, if it were to behave such that I behave, that if there is something rotten perhaps that has fallen down in my kitchen and I had not noticed it and now it's beginning to smell, I'm going to pick it up and throw it away. I'm going to take it away from the center place, away from my home, away from my living space, because my living space ought not to be polluted with such garbage. It is something that ruins the experience of life in that environment. And so my mind oscillates, even though the first part of that, him shall the people curse, it's referring to a type of collective there, the people. But there's more of a reference to the individual than there is in terms of the nation, because now the nation is not just, it's implied that there's many individuals, but when we hear the word nation, we think of the unity of the whole, rather than the whole as opposed to the people, individual elements. And so this oscillation that occurs within my mind, I think, is exactly the point of what is being said here, or at least it is, if it's not meant to be, it's an effect that it's having on me. And I have to wonder, this spirit of the nation, as it recoils, as I, as an individual, almost like a cell in the collective of this agent that is the nation, is moved up within this storm of revulsion and is feeling this disgust and wishes nothing more than to take out the garbage of corruption, to take out the insincerity, to take out the greed, to take out the weakness from our society. I find it within my heart. I find the rottenness within myself. And it's encouraging in some way, because I can control that which is inside of me. I can play my part in fixing it. I could rid myself of it, or at least try to. I could try to make myself better. And in so doing, around me, I can also influence those that may have this within them as well. And as this spirit and the agent pulls away, the experience must necessarily be that what is being pulled away is the greed and the corruption from the heart of every man that is involved with the motion of the nation spirit. Now, of course, if the nation spirit is divided and it's fighting among the components of itself, trying to identify itself, then that complicates matters. And I think that's sort of what we're dealing with. But eventually, it will come together to be something. And when it is something, when it figures itself out, there will be more of this collective pull, I think, as we are being asked to prompt, or asked to reflect on. Nation shall abhor him. That it is the unification of that collective that is now expressing this emotion and this disgust. But to them that rebuke him shall be delight, and a good blessing shall come upon them. So let's follow some steps to get to a satisfactory idea of why it would be the case that those that rebuke the man that has attributed wickedness to righteousness, or has thought of righteousness as though as it is wickedness, that then he is brought to the state of delight. Well, much of the groundwork, I think, is already laid. For the individual that attributes wickedness to righteousness is destroying all that which is good. They're taking away the path. They're taking away the way for which a human being can come to understand the divine good. And they are bringing it down into self-centeredness, ultimately evil, but self-centeredness, wishes and desires, the pollution of the heart, such that all that matters is the satisfaction of personal desires, which mustn't necessarily, I think, be vain and superficial, whether it be any number of appetites, whatever. But when somebody stands up and says, well, no, this is wrong because of this, there is this reason not to believe it because this may become as consequence that we may fall into darkness and despair because of our miscalculation. The delight, or that great pleasure, interesting here that we're talking about pleasure when we're trying to, it's a type of pleasure perhaps, it's where it is placed. Instead of being placed in the center of the self, it is placed in something that is well outside of the self, a belief in something that is greater than the self, that is responsible for the well-being of the self, or that can bring the self to well-being, true well-being. And we can consider this practically, that at the end of the road that we are on, if it is to end or to abruptly fall off a cliff into absolute despair and nothingness, the absence of experience, eventually we would slow down. We would stop before our vehicle had reached the end and went over the cliff, because it doesn't make any sense to do it. And as we do so, we would realize how mistaken we were to take the path towards that end. And it's probably most likely the case for many that the end is unseen to most, because we are blinded by the insular nature. We are blinded by that auto-actualization. It is inherently a limiting worldview, a worldview that would not necessarily allow us to see that we are actually on the path to our own destruction. But the understanding of that, the understanding of the broader picture of the way, will allow us to see the path that we are on, to reflect on where it is leading us, and to correct course if necessary, well before we get to the point where we have to start to worry about it. And so I think that this is the consequence of the rebuke. And the delight is the cherishing and the understanding that we are actually not on the path of darkness, that we are driving towards something that is meaningful and productive, fruitful. And I think that there's a bit of irony, always there's a bit of irony, that I think on the road to darkness, it is still a road, it is still a path. Man can experience many things on a path, on a road, even if it is to his own death, even if it is to the path to addiction. He may have a lot of fun times, drinking alcohol with his friends, doing various substances, whatever. But once the road has been taken, accepted, then it is almost as if something else is driving while he is just a passenger in the seat. Because the true driver is choosing the alcohol. It is choosing the types of behavior that step on the gas, that lead him towards the end. But it is only the agent above him that understands that his behavior will lead him to death. Now he himself that is caught in the superficial and the vain doesn't see it. But the driver, the agent above, sees it. And it is the reorganization and the reorienting to one's responsibility that allows him to regain his agency and to kick out the one that controls him. A good blessing shall come upon them. Now, a blessing perhaps is the opposite of a curse. It is something that comes down. It is something that is enacted, perhaps. It is something that is purposeful and meaningful. It is favor. It is protection from the agent that is again beyond the individual, but instead of driving the individual towards nothingness, it is driving the individual towards goodness, towards productivity, towards salvation, realization, facilitation. It doesn't guarantee peace. In fact, a blessing, I think, can be quite opposite. It can be quite painful. Consider the blessing that is given to a man that is within the stranglehold of addiction. Imagine the pill that one has to swallow to wake up from such a nightmare. Every man shall kiss his lips that gives a right answer. Now, every once in a while, I'll read a verse, and I'll have trouble finding exactly the place where I should start. This verse, and there are a few verses that I've commented in such a way, but this verse seems as though, on the surface, after the first read, that there is not much to it. But of course, as always, I come back to the view that I hold quite closely, that the Proverbs, and more than just the Proverbs, surely many books of the Bible have this quality to them, but in particular the Proverbs, while we have relatedness between chapters, relatedness within chapters, each individual verse can stand alone for the most part. And because of this, they are like little keys that open up different doors that lead into different environments. Now, it is not so much the directive that we are after when we read a verse in the Proverbs. At least from my perspective, I'm not looking to be told to do something. I'm looking to be guided to the way of understanding what to do and why to do it. I suppose that I'm not unopposed to a directive, if it may come. But often I find myself wanting the reason for something. Why something is the way that it is. Something to wrestle with, rather than to be given something like a prize or like a dessert that is unearned. Every man shall kiss his lips that gives a right answer. So a rather bizarre verse. Seems rather bizarre gesture. A man that is kissing the lips of another man. Now, I suppose it doesn't need to be said, but there really is no, of the physical nature, within the domain of the sexual. I think that we are well away from that. We are being pointed in a direction that is unfamiliar to me, at least in terms of the gesture, in terms of the custom. The image that occurs when it is suggested that every man shall kiss the lips that gives a right answer, kiss his lips that give a right answer. I'm quickly prompted out of the physical image and more towards the symbol of what that behavior might entail, or what a kiss might engender, or it might mean. And here I refer to the way that I had started this verse, about this uncertainty, about the risk that is involved with exploring something that potentially may be unfruitful. But again, the verse is a key, not necessarily a directive. So the question is then, well, what key, or what door does this key open? I suppose that I have to understand to a degree what it would mean to kiss another person, of the various ways in which the human being has oriented this behavior, has found this behavior appropriate, under what circumstances, under what conditions. Now, culturally, I think we are moving away from physical contact, at least in terms of kissing on the cheek. There are many cultures that have a custom of kissing on the cheek, either in terms of greeting or in terms of goodbyes. My family happened to be one of them. When I was younger, I experienced a lot of this sort of thing upon greeting and leaving. I found the gesture to be interesting. As I've gotten older, I've moved away from it. Temperamentally, I think I'm not a very physically oriented person in terms of the way that I show affection. But nonetheless, this affection, I think, is key, and the showing of affection is important. Of affection, I think that we can say that it is a feeling. It is a feeling that can be expressed in the behavior of that kiss. But the feeling is oriented in a particular way, of course. As I've mentioned, there are things for which this verse would suggest, or rather would bar from consideration. Generally, I think what we are considering is a feeling of fondness or liking. Perhaps we can say love. Love, of course, something that is different than something that is purely pleasing, or something that is purely the desire of another. For there are plenty of things that I think that we can desire and find pleasing. Like chocolate, for example. We may say that we love chocolate. And in such a way, we would be expressing some intense desire or appreciation for the object. But if we are to consider love in this way, I think that we would surely understand that there is a gradation to this intense desire and feeling, if it is the case that a person can attribute his intense, his ability, his faculties, his innermost desire, the fire of his experience, the fire of his longing, again, the fire of his attention. I suppose if it is possible that he may attribute this sort of experience to, or behavior to, anything, including objects, I suppose we can call it love. But then if we go farther and say, well, perhaps there are ways in which the feeling can be amplified, and if we go farther than that, more than just amplified, perhaps we can say that it is something that is sustaining, that is fulfilling. We may have an experience that is particularly exciting, that fuels a rush of endorphins. Perhaps something that we wish to happen often, but we know that cannot happen regularly. These sorts of experiences are often superficial and vain, and it is not what I wish to consider. What I think of is much like our condition, that we are bound to food and water to sustain ourselves. It would seem that we are bound to love in such a way that we are required to sustain ourselves in whatever way, to direct the innermost feelings and desires towards something, whether it be an object or a person, whatever. Love, I think, has a relationship to wisdom, and wisdom to love. I don't see how it is possible otherwise. Understanding and knowledge is wound up in this as well. If we are to say, going back to the original thought, that there is this gradation for which we can consider things that are loved, or that are possible to be loved, more so than just one direction, one way flow of information, I think we can zoom out a little bit and imagine a network, an infrastructure for which information is exchanged and transmitted under differing circumstances and situations. I can say that because of complexity, we can find a different level of love, perhaps. But it is also possible to find it within the simple, within the bond of two people, rather than within a multitude. So perhaps we cannot find it, we cannot say that it would be found in one or the other, because it is in both. We could say that it is found in fleeting experiences, but also long-lasting ones. It seems to be a thin line that permeates everything and anything our attention touches, or the attention of that which is beyond us, or that which is, touches us. Now, I think that there is something that we are being prompted to consider here that is along this line. Every man shall kiss his lips that gives a right answer. A right answer, that which is an observation about something that is correct, that is appropriate. That there is an appropriateness to our knowing and to our understanding. Appropriate given something else that sets the standard of what is to be considered appropriate, of course. I think standards are set all over the place, and we can see them quite readily, but it's hard to say exactly where the standard is, where the limit and the capacity of something to govern, where that comes to rest. Is it within the small, within the large? Again, it seems to be throughout everything. But before I give in to a definition of love that doesn't make much sense, and it's so broad that it really doesn't have much meaning, I think about my own life, and I think about the experiences that I've had with the things that I call love. And then I try to imagine the highest form of that love that I've experienced. And the strange thing is that it is not a memory that I can really lay out. It is not something that is concrete. It is not a particular event. It's almost more of a way, perhaps I can identify particular events, but in the identification of the particular events, it wouldn't necessarily get to the root of the matter. Eventually, it would come back to the way or the broader picture of the experience. And without having to share too many personal details, I had lost somebody that was close to me when I was young. And I was young enough to have some appreciation for this person. But I was at the age where the type of relationship and deep interpersonal connection with this person just was not really possible at the adult level. Possible at the level of a child, which is perhaps more pure. But the point is that what I remember is a feeling that is attached to a few hazy memories. But within the feeling, it is a type of memory. A memory, but also something of a procedure, something of a key, just like a proverb, to open up the door to something. Perhaps that's the door to my heart. And as I open the door to my heart, what comes forth are some of those feelings, some of the purest feelings that I have ever experienced. Feelings that I would not trade. Now, I've had the experience of drinking enough alcohol or taking particular substances that cause me to be quite euphoric, whatever the situation might be, but as a sober person and a sober mind, that sort of thing has nothing in comparison to what is held within this box. This box that, again, is the way to something. It is an experience of love that I have difficulty describing, but it is a gift. It is a gift that perhaps it is held up by certain memories, but hazy memories. The memories perhaps are the key. They are the Proverbs to open that box. And once it's open, what comes forth is affection. What comes forth is drive, What comes forth is the facilitatory. It is the enhancement of my experience, the willingness to live a full life, to be an active participant in the world, and to go out and to find something that I can recognize as the same thing, but not recognize it in the same way that a heroin addict would try to achieve another high, to recognize the same feeling and experience. It is more so to grow it and to nurture it. And I think that this expression of the right answer, much like love, I think we can find it in many places. Solving a math problem or finding the answer to an existential crisis. In both situations, what we have found is something good, something pure. We have found a solution. We have unlocked that rightness. Perhaps we can extend it to righteousness to a degree, I'm not really sure, but there is, within that which is right, I think we can find what is just, what is good, what is beautiful, that which is well-oriented, well-contextualized, balanced. And the kiss is a symbol of that affection, of that fondness for what that rightness is, whatever level or layer that we find it to be at. And so I'll leave that as it is and move on to the next verse. Prepare your work without, and make it fit for yourself in the field, and afterwards build your house. So I like this verse. Definitely useful advice to a younger person, or an older person, I suppose it doesn't matter. Prepare your work without. This is where we must start. So I'd like to take a literal interpretation of this verse. And I'd like to start with the word without. Now the word with, by itself, implies to me that there is a relationship, that there is an accompaniment, that if something is with me, then it may imply possession, it probably implies proximity, certainly it implies association, because I can say something is with me in all sorts of different contexts. I can say that I have my phone with me, implying that the phone is likely in my pocket. It implies a proximity, but it also implies a close association. I could say that my mother is with me. My mother died when I was young, when I was 8 years old. And yet, if I say that she's with me, she's not physically with me in the way that my phone is with me. She is with me in the sense of the broader aspect of mind. She is with me in the sense that she has given me something, as I've mentioned, I think, earlier in this podcast. And this type of association is quite different from that of the phone analogy. And yet there are two ways in which we can use the word with. I can say that I am having dinner with a friend of mine. Again, it implies an association, a level of proximity, but there's something more there, because I can be close to somebody but not be with them. There can be a stranger that I'm eating by, and yet I'm not eating with them. I think there are certain situations in which we consider ourselves to be with somebody if we are engaged in sort of reciprocal behavior. So if we are going to take the word without, it's a rather strange word to my mind, because we're taking the word with and pairing it with the word out. Now, of the word out, we use expressions like out of town, which means that of the geographical space that the town is in, the person has left that space to go into a new geographical location. We can use the word out and say something like we are out of time, which is another strange expression. It is as though we are considering, much like the analogy of the city, that time has this boundary around it, or rather, our experience has or our participation in a particular experience has a particular time-limited boundary, and if we cross that boundary, then we are out of time. If we are taking a test, for example, the test is proctored. Let's say we are given 60 minutes. When the 60 minutes runs up, then we are out of the time that was allotted. We may say that we are out of time in terms of life. An older person may say this, or a person that is sick with disease may say that I am out of time. And what is meant that the time that is allotted for the totality of their lives has run out, that has come to an end. There's a finality to this outness, in a sense of being away from the center point of attention. So we have this strange meaning of proximity, of closeness, and then almost a word that is opposite of being away from. Away from a thing of concern. Now, if we say that we are without something, then we are accompanied to the outness of a particular circumstance. And we can imagine the circumstance that has some boundary circled around it, whether it's physical, whether it's conceptual, whether it's dimensional, like time. So the question is then, if we are preparing ourselves or preparing our work without, what does it mean for us as people, as individuals, to do something without? Because there is an implication of something that we are within if we are to go outside of it. Now, before we get there, I'm going to take the rather sluggish approach to going over the words prepare and work. Now, I understand this is probably more than necessary, but this is the only way that my mind will be satisfied. Now, a simple definition of the word prepare is to make something ready for use or consideration. Is to make someone ready or something ready to be able to do or to deal with something. Now, work being is some effort done to achieve a purpose or result. So in the first instance, this preparation, it must begin at the conscious level. There must be some decision that is made in order for the work to be enacted. So what happens in terms of this progression, I think, is that we are beginning within the mind. So the inness, we are accompanied with, or we are accompanied, maybe I should say that the boundary of inness is reflective of the inner self, inner self is not a good way to express it, is reflective of the self in general, perhaps I should say. And when we say, if this preparation is to be something that is begot within, what we are with is the preparedness. What we are with is the consideration, or with the attention towards an idea or a thought of doing something or exerting some effort towards some end or purpose. So if that begins within, what we are being instructed to do is to make sure that this actually occurs outside of the environment of the self. That there is a distinction here, that one can do much within the mind, but it must also translate to the physical world. The second part of the verse, and make it fit for yourself in the field. Now, in the agricultural sense, the field is certainly not something that is only within my mind. The field may be represented within my mind as I go back to my house and I consider what I must do in the sense of that preparation. But as I go out, the field is something that is independent of myself. And so in essence, what I'm doing is that I am consciously putting forth an effort to translate or to transmit my thoughts from the mental domain or the conscious domain into the domain of the physical. Now, it seems very simple to relate it in this way, and I think it is meant to be quite simple, but in order to get there, it was really anything but simple. The understanding, almost the exercise of understanding that relationship of the inside and the outside, was as important as the meaning of this verse. Now, I think this matter of fittedness is quite important. And make it fit for yourself in the field. So the question is, well, what is it? And make it fit for yourself. It's referring to the work. And so the question now is, well, what does it mean to make the work fit to ourselves? The work is an expression of our efforts towards some end. Fittedness, perhaps we can say that, at least in part, it can be considered a quality, standard, or some type of something to meet a required purpose. I think of relevance here. I think of that which is appropriate. So, for instance, if we are hungry, and this is something that is necessary, the satisfaction of that desire is necessary in order to sustain our existence, then what we ought to do is to put in the type of work that fits that prerequisite to maintain existence. Now, the interesting question is, when we have satisfied the work in the field, in a certain sense, that we have reduced the amount of tension that is necessary to solve the sustenance problem, that we are, for the most part, nourished, and we don't spend excess time and attention towards procuring the resources necessary to maintain the body, then our attention is focused elsewhere, on different things. We separate ourselves into different avenues. The problems that we choose to solve become different. Our attention is liberated, in a sense, free to go in, again, different directions. But what becomes of a person's purpose when the means for procuring or maintaining or to enable his existence to continue is not wound up in the maintenance or the continuation, perhaps, the perpetual attention given to the stomach as a means to survive, then what becomes purposeful and what becomes meaningful on an existential level, I think, changes quite a bit. I think the body doesn't go away. There are still things that we have to do to maintain it, and our attention is, I think, allocated in that sense, or at least it ought to be culturally, to the body. That even though that we are abundant in our resources and in our food, we still have to make wise decisions about what we do, and we have to spend time devoted to regular practice of working out. And I think that is an interesting word in and of itself, much like the word without, because we are working something out, we're working away from something, and I think that something is generally, if it is done right, I think that there are plenty of things that we can choose to work out or move ourselves from one place to another, cross some boundary into a new sphere. But I think the most productive is to move away from weakness, to move away from poor health, away from the sedentary life. And there are plenty of different things that I think we can put within that we're trying to work in, and say of plenty of things that we are trying to move away from to work out. But apart from the physical and returning to mind, the problems of the field become quite interesting, because where is the field now? The field that would satisfy, that would maintain, that would allow to continue the productive existence of the conscious sphere of man, not just his body, but of his mind. And society now, and I've had this experience personally, in which the mind has fallen into a type of failure to meet its needs. Now, the irony is that in the case of the hungry belly, the physical body sort of takes over for the needs of the mind, that the mind is so concerned about the body, that the attention is so allocated towards procuring resources for the body, that the certain problems of mind just don't really come into view. That level or layer of reality is not open or immediately desirable, because it is not the thing that's not the plane that will satisfy the existence or the continuation of the organism. But now, and I myself included, we are in a position, in a relative sense, again, the body is not gone. We're not separating our minds from the body, but our attention is capable of pursuing things that are much larger. And I think that there's a lot to be said here about the specifics in this idea, because before the Industrial Revolution, it's not as though that the entirety of man's conscious sphere was involved with the procurement of agricultural resources. A large part of it was, that perhaps if we go farther and farther back, especially in the days that are pre-civilizational, I'd imagine that these circumstances would be greater in those populations. We've done quite a lot in the field of psychological technology to progress past certain levels of mind. But in the modern age, we're at an unprecedented level for which we can explore. And it would seem that, for whatever reason, those who are the intellectual classes have felt it appropriate to turn the mind towards something that is unproductive, nihilistic, antagonistic, negative, destructive, evil, perhaps, towards nothing. Prepare your work without, and make it fit for yourself in the field, and afterwards build your house. So this is a conversation that we have had many times about the nature of the house versus the home, or different ways in which the word house can be used. And I think that this warrants a familiar conversation or reflection. So we are being instructed to build something within the mind, to create something, and to translate it through to the physical world. Now this translation and the efforts that we put forth to fulfill some end, for some purpose, a purpose probably to sustain ourselves in some way. In the modern day, this of course would be doing something occupationally to receive payment. Once we've received payment, then we are in a position to start building a life, building a house, a home. Now, in the ideal situation, I think that an individual would possess the skills necessary to build a house. Now, houses these days are quite complex, and they require multiple people with different expertise to put it together. From laying the foundation to installing the various appliances, the electrical work, plumbing, all of this sort of thing. But I think what we are really referring to here when it says build the house, we're continuing along the line of reflection that we just came off of. So it is not an entirely physical statement, although there is obvious relation to the physical statement. So we began within the mind. We were prompted to prepare there. Then we were asked to execute without. So it would have some actionable space in the physical domain. Now I think what we are prompted to do is to go back within and repeat the process that had made us successful, or that had made us self-reliant. Now, there are many different ways to go here, but what my mind is considering now, just thinking about what it means to be an individual, what it means to be self-reliant. There must be many things that are learned out in the field, and they are necessary to learn because it increases the fittedness of one's behavior to the goals, or one's successful behavior as they align to their goals, or their relationship to their goals. And this, much like the reading of the Proverbs, is a way in and of itself. It is a type of practice that one does not only to gain the skills necessary, but also to undergo the process of trial and error, of failure, and of success. Now, I believe that this is one of the reasons why we are being prompted to build a house after the work has been conducted without. That there is experience gained in the world, that the house is no simple matter, although there certainly can be and there will be mistakes when building a house, both physically and also in the spiritual sense of bringing together people to live in the house, building a family, which is part of establishing a home, I would say. Now, I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'm going to continue next time with verse 28 of chapter 24 of the Proverbs.